And as we can see here, 20 enemies have been spawned, so no more are spawning. So we'd have to kill them for them to then go away. This tutorial is going to cover enemy spawning. I will be showing you how to set up an infinite spawner, so enemies will continue to spawn up until there is a certain number of enemies on the screen, which will save the game from lagging on mobile devices. The difficulty of the game will also be considered, making enemies spawn closer and closer together as the game progresses. So let's jump straight into the code. I'm going to create a new C# script, and this is going to be my game controller. So let's open that one up. So I'm going to delete these. I'm firstly going to set some variables. The first one is going to be distance, so we can have private, static, float distance. I'm going to set that equal to 0. Can also have a private, static, float, difficulty multiplier, which is going to be equal to 1 by default. And a private, static, float. This can be our difficulty offset. And I might set that to 100F. We can change it. It's all up to you. We'll also need a private static int, and this is going to be our enemy count. So we can count our enemies. Now I'm going to create public references to these. So we can do this by typing in public static float, and I'm going to type in distance with a capital D. And in our curly braces, I'm going to say we're going to get our distance. So every time we grab this, we're going to get the distance. And we're going to set our distance equal to a value. So every time we go to set the distance to a new value, it's going to be equal to whatever that value is. And it's going to refer back to this float. And we're going to do the same thing for all of these variables. We also need an instance, which is a reference to the game controller itself. So we can have a public static game controller, and we'll call this one instance. We need an awake void. In our void awake, we're just going to set instance equal to this. We also need an update void. And what we're going to do here is we're going to update our difficulty multiplier. So our difficulty multiplier is going to increase. So I'll show you how to do that. So difficulty multiplier is going to equal to, so we always want to make it a base rate of 1. So we're always spawning at least one enemy. And we want 1 plus, and this is going to be our distance divided by our difficulty offset. So every single frame, our difficulty is going to increase by the distance divided by our offset. So if our distance is 1 meter, it's 1 divided by 100 plus 1. So if we grab a calculator, we can see that 1 divided by 100 is 0.01, and plus 1, that's going to be 1.01. Okay, so once we reach 100 meters divided by 100, that's just going to be 1 plus 1 is 2. Every 100 meters, we're going to increase the difficulty value by 1. Next, we need to update our UI controller. So if we just open that up, we need to add a distance text, and we're going to be using Text Mesh Pro. So I'm going to be using TMP row. And so what I'm going to do is we're going to serialize our field, and we can have a private Text Mesh Pro UGUI. This can be our distance text. And make sure that's equal to null by default so we don't get any cautions in the editor. And in our update void, we can update our distance. So we can set our game controller dot distance to plus equal to time dot delta time multiplied by a time modifier. So we need to also create a time modifier. which we have right here. Now, after we've set our distance, we need to set our actual text. So our distance text.text is going to equal to string.format, and we're going to format it in meters. So we can say 0 and 0, so we only want whole numbers, and I'll put an M, so to show meters, and we can put a comma, and the value is going to be our game controller dot distance. Make sure we just put a semicolon there. We need to make sure the string is in uppercase, and this is going to give an error because it doesn't exist in the current context. Now to fix this, we can type in using system. So now we can access the string library. The next thing we need to do is update our object spawner, because we want to actually be able to spawn our enemies. And I'm going to use a couple of structs to help structure this inside of our editor. So if we type in system.serializable, and then we can type in public struct, and this can be our spawnable struct, and we want a public string of type, so the type of spawnable, and we want a public float of weight. So what this will allow us to do with the weight is, say if we have two spawnables, like a small enemy and a big enemy, we could set the small enemy's weight to 0.75 and the big enemy's weight to 0.25, which would give the small enemy a 75% chance of spawning and the big enemy a 25% chance of spawning. So this allows you to have multiple types of enemies in your game. Now we also want another struct, so I'm going to type in system.serializable again, and this time we can have a public struct, and this can be our spawn settings. So I'm going to have a public string, so the type. So in case you want to spawn multiple things, we could be spawning enemies. So this one might be for just enemies. We might have like obstacles in the way or trees or something. If you want to add a jumping feature, I don't know, it's up to you. And we'll also have a public float for our min wait. So this is the minimum amount of time that we want to wait before spawning. And we'll have a public float for our max wait, which is the maximum amount of time we want to wait before spawning. We'll also have a public int max objects. So this is the maximum amount of objects that we want to spawn. We've got our spawning object variable, which we've created before, so that'll be useful. We also want to add a private float, which is going to be the total weight. And this will be the total weight of our spawnables, which we'll create in a list in a second. So under here, I'm going to create a public list of type spawnable, and I'll call this enemy spawnables. This can equal to a new list of type spawnable. We also want a public list for our spawner settings. So public list of type spawn settings. Oops. We want a list, not a light map legacy. And I'll call this our spawn settings. This can be equal to a new list of type spawn settings. So this allows us to actually be able to add all of our enemies into a list. So if we want 5 enemies, we can add them in, and they'll all have these values inside each enemy spawnable, which is nice. Now we want to update the awake void, and on awake, we want our total weight to be equal to 0. And then we can say for each spawnable in our enemy spawnables, we want the total weight to plus equal to the spawnable dot weight. So what it's going to do is it's going to add up the total weight. So in case you have like an error or something, it should always be fine. So it's going to base it off the total weight of everything. So after the spawn ground, what we can do is we can add an update void, and this will control our spawning. So if we are not spawning an object and our game, our game controller dot enemy count is less than our spawn settings at 0, because we know that the first one we're going to create is going to be for our enemies, dot max objects. So say we only want 20 enemies in the scene, we can put 20 and then we'll use this value. So as long as our enemy count is less than 20 or whatever value you choose, then we're going to set spawning object equal to true. We're going to have a float pick, which is going to be equal to a random dot value, and we're going to multiply it by the total weight. Now we can have an int of our chosen index. This is going to be 0. We can have a float of our cumulative weight, and this is going to be equal to our enemy spawnables at 0 dot weight. Now we're going to do a while loop. So while our pick is greater than the cumulative weight and our chosen index is less than the enemy spawnables dot count minus 1, then what we're going to do is we're going to increment our chosen index, and we're going to set our cumulative weight to plus equal to our enemy spawnables at our chosen index dot weight. And once that's done, once it's gone through all of the enemy spawnables, it will have picked one based on our pick value. And once that's done, we can start a coroutine which will actually spawn our object. So I'm going to type in start coroutine. So we're going to spawn our object as an IE numerator, and the first value we want is what we're going to spawn, so our enemy spawnables at our chosen index dot type, and the type should be the same as the name that we want. So we can say enemy and then it'll spawn an enemy, so we might have to add that in, but for now we'll continue. We also want where we want to spawn it, so we can set a random dot range between our spawn settings at 0 dot min weight, and we're going to divide that by the game controller dot difficulty multiplier. So that's for the minimum range, and then for the maximum range we're going to do similar. So spawn settings at 0 dot max weight, and that's also going to be divided by our game controller dot difficulty multiplier. So that is going to calculate a random time based on our min and max weight, and also based on our difficulty. So as our difficulty increases, this value will get bigger, and then it'll get harder. So the enemies will spawn faster and faster. But now we need to create a spawn object coroutine. So I'm going to do it just up here. We can have a private IE numerator, and this can be called spawn object. And what we want is a string for the type, and we also want a float for the time, which is what we've just put in. We're going to firstly yield return new, and we're gonna wait for seconds. So we're gonna wait for the amount of time that we've set. And then we're gonna grab our object puller dot instance dot spawn from pool. And we're gonna spawn the type. And then we're gonna create a new vector 3 for our position. This can be a random.range because we want to spawn a random range on our X values. If we head into our game, as you can see, we've got our enemy here and we want to spawn it somewhere between -4.4 and 4.4. Okay. So that's the range that we can set. You can change it based on your ground. So I'm going to type in -4.4F and 4.4F. Now for the Y value, let's have a look. Our enemy's at 0.5 on the Y, which is fine. And we'll also check the Z value while we're here. So we want to spawn the enemy where we can't see it. So somewhere around here. So I might set it to -3. So that was 0.5F and then 3F, or -3F, sorry. Awesome. And then for the rotation, we want quaternion dot identity, and then we can set spawning object, oops, to false because we have spawned our object now. And then we can set our game controller dot enemy count to ++ because we want to count our enemies so we can do this check. Next, we need to update our health component. So let's open up the health component. Now in our update, under our if current health is less than or equal to 0, we can do an if. We can get our game object dot tag. We're going to check if that is equal to enemy, and if it is, we want to do all of this stuff. So I'm just going to put it inside our if statement. And we also want our game controller dot enemy count to -. Just like that. Okay, so now we can head into the editor and we can compile all the code. Firstly, let's add our game controller object. So let's create an empty. I'm gonna reset the transform. I will call it game controller. We can tag it with game controller, and we'll add our game controller script to it. In our object puller, we've already got an enemy, which is fine, but we also need to update our object spawner. So our enemy spawnables, we want to set that to 1. So the type is going to be enemy because we're spawning this type. If you had multiple enemies, you'd increase your pool size, add your new type of enemy, and then you could increase this. The weight, I'm going to give it 1 because we only have 1 enemy to spawn. Our spawn settings are also set to 1. Our type is going to be for our enemy. So I might set the minimum wait to 0.5 seconds and the maximum wait to 5 seconds. And the maximum amount of objects that we can spawn is going to be 20 for our enemies. Now the next thing we need to do is create a text mesh pro object. So in our canvas, we can create a UI text mesh pro, but we need to import text mesh pro essentials. So that's fine. Now we don't need the examples and the extras, but I will call this the distance text. And the text can be, we'll just say 0M for now. Might set it to bold. It's a bit small, so we can definitely make it bigger. So might set it to like 128. And if we have a look in our scene, we definitely need to move it up a bit. So I might just like that. Might make it a bit wider. And also might center it. Now we can just chuck it on top of our charge bar. Might put it a little bit smaller. Awesome. But we also need to set our distance text with our UI controller. So let's just drag it in here. Sweet. And let's have a look now. So if I click on play, you can see our meters are going up. You might want to add an outline to your text. We've got 1 enemy, 2, 3. All of our enemies are spawning, which is lovely. And you can see that they all come towards us. And it looks like there's a bit of issues because I'm just letting them attack me. They're all bumping around. Now this is just because we've made it so that they can't collide with each other, so they're sort of spazzing out everywhere. But also, as you can see here, we've got 20 enemies here out of our 50. Got about 200 FPS. This will be different depending on your computer. So that looks fine. I might actually change our enemy collider. So we could set it to is kinematic and override that. Now also, you might not like it that there's like 50 meters before the enemies start attacking you. And what you can do to fix that is you can change the camera, and then you'd have to change the Z value of where they spawn. Right now, since my player is currently at the end here, there's a lot of ground that we can see. And as we can see here, 20 enemies have been spawned, so no more are spawning. So we'd have to kill them for them to then go away. So we forgot to add an enemy tag to our enemies. So we'll have to add a new tag, and I'll call it enemy. And we can tag the enemy and make sure we override that. So always make sure you go edit, project settings, editor. You can set any iOS device or any Android device. So let's try that again. One last time. Okay, so the enemy dies now, which is fine. And so now I'll just do a little test. We can wait till we've got 20 enemies spawned, which we're getting there. I think that's it. So if I just start killing these enemies, more enemies start spawning, which is awesome. So that optimizes our mobile game. So then we're not going to have too many lag issues depending on what phone you're running it on. Obviously, there's always going to be a few issues with that. There can always be issues with UI as well, so just keep in mind for those sort of things when you're making your mobile game. So I want to thank Benonis and Joshua, my 2 monthly Patreons. Be sure to pledge on Patreon if you can. I also have a Discord server, so come and hang out on that. Links in the description. If you liked the video, be sure to leave a thumbs up and subscribe for more content. Thanks.